his kinsman Roger Earl of Rutland, rather to go 100 miles to speak with one wise man, than 5 miles to see a fair town. I described to him an impudent fellow from Scotland, who affected to be a savage, and railed at all established systems. Johnson. There is nothing surprising in this, sir. He wants to make himself conspicuous. He would tumble in a hog-sty as long as you looked at him and called to him to come out. But let him alone, never mind him, and he'll soon give it over. I added that the same person maintained that there was no distinction between virtue and vice. Johnson. Why, sir, if the fellow does not think as he speaks, he's lying, and I see not what honour he can propose to himself from having the character of a liar. But if he does really think that there is no distinction between virtue and vice, why, sir, when he leaves our houses, let us count our spoons. Sir David Dalrymple, now one of the judges of Scotland by the title of Lord Hailes, had contributed much to increase my high opinion of Johnson on account of his writings, long before I attained to a personal acquaintance with him. I, in return, had informed Johnson of Sir David's eminent character for learning and religion, and Johnson was so much pleased that at one of our evening meetings he gave him for his toast. I at this time kept up a very frequent correspondence with Sir David, and I read to Dr. Johnson to-night the following passage from the letter which I had last received from him. It gives me pleasure to think that you have obtained the friendship of Mr. Samuel Johnson. He is one of the best moral writers which England has produced. At the same time I envy you the free and undisguised converse with such a man. May I beg you to present my best respects to him, and to assure him of the veneration which I entertain for the author of The Rambler and of Rasselas. Let me recommend this last work to you. With The Rambler you are certainly acquainted. In Rasselas you will see a tender-hearted operator, who probes the wound only to heal it. Swift, on the contrary, mangles human nature. He cuts and slashes as if he took pleasure in the operation, like the tyrant who said, Ita feri, ut se sentiat emori. Johnson seemed to be gratified by this just and well-turned compliment. He recommended to me to keep a journal of my life, full and unreserved. He said it would be a very good exercise, and would yield me great satisfaction when the particulars were faded from my remembrance. I was uncommonly fortunate in having had a previous coincidence of opinion with him upon this subject, for I had kept such a journal for some time, and it was no small pleasure to me to have this to tell him, and to receive his approbation. He counselled me to keep it private, and said that I might surely have a friend who would burn it in case of my death. From this habit I have been enabled to give the world so many anecdotes which would otherwise have been lost to posterity. I mentioned that I was afraid to put into my journal too many little incidents. Johnson. There is nothing, sir, too little for so little a creature as man. It is by studying little things that we attain the great art of having as little misery and as much happiness as possible. Next morning Mr. Dempster happened to call on me, and was so much struck even with the imperfect account which I gave him of Dr. Johnson's conversation, that to his honour be it recorded, when I complained that drinking port and sitting up late with him affected my nerves for some time after, he said, one had better be palsied at 18 than not keep company with such a man. On Tuesday, July the 18th, I found tall Sir Thomas Robinson sitting with Johnson. Sir Thomas said that the King of Prussia valued himself upon 3 things, upon being a hero, a musician, and an author. Johnson. Pretty well, sir, for one man. As to his being an author, I have not looked at his poetry, but his prose is poor stuff. He writes just as you might suppose Voltaire's footboy to do, who has been his amanuensis. He has such parts as the valet might have, and about as much of the colouring of the style as might be got by transcribing his works. When I was at Ferney, I repeated this to Voltaire in order to reconcile him somewhat to Johnson, whom he, in affecting the English mode of expression, had previously characterized as a superstitious dog. But after hearing such criticism on Frederick the Great, with whom he was then on bad terms, he explained, "An honest fellow." But I think the criticism much too severe, for the memoirs of the House of Brandenburg are written as well as many works of that kind. His poetry, for the style of which he himself makes a frank apology, jargonnant un François barbare, though fraught with pernicious ravings of infidelity, has, in many places, a great animation, and in some a pathetic tenderness. Upon this contemptuous animadversion on the King of Prussia, I observed to Johnson, "It would seem then, sir, that much less parts are necessary to make a king than to make an author. For the King of Prussia is confessedly the greatest king now in Europe, yet you think he makes a very poor figure as an author." Mr. Levitt this day showed me Dr. Johnson's library, which was contained in 2 garrets over his chambers, where Lintot, son of the celebrated bookseller of that name, had formerly his warehouse. I found a number of good books, but very dusty and in great confusion. The floor was strewed with manuscript leaves in Johnson's own handwriting, which I beheld with a degree of veneration, supposing they perhaps might contain portions of the Rambler or of Rasselas. I observed an apparatus for chemical experiments, of which Johnson was all his life very fond. The place seemed to be very favourable for retirement and meditation. Johnson told me that he went up thither without mentioning it to his servant when he wanted to study, secure from interruption, for he would not allow his servant to say that he was not at home when he really was. "A servant's strict regard for truth," said he, "must be weakened by such a practice. A philosopher may know that it is merely a form of denial, but few servants are such nice distinguishers. If I accustom a servant to lie for me, have I not reason to apprehend that he will tell many lies for himself? I am, however, satisfied that every servant of any degree of intelligence understands saying his master is not at home, not at all as the affirmation of a fact, but as customary words, intimating that his master wishes not to be seen, so that there can be no bad effect from it." Mr. Temple, now vicar of St. Gluvius, Cornwall, who had been my intimate friend for many years, had at this time chambers in Farrar's Buildings, at the bottom of Inner Temple Lane, which he kindly lent me upon my quitting my lodgings, he being to return to Trinity Hall, Cambridge. I found them particularly convenient for me, as they were so near Dr. Johnson's. Section 28.